Ukraine recently signed a letter of intent with Sweden to purchase between 100 and 150 Saab Gripen E fighter jets, marking not only the largest Gripen order in the aircraft's history but what promises to become the single largest foreign defense contract ever awarded to a Swedish company. The sheer scale of this procurement, potentially doubling Saab's existing total production commitments, speaks to just how seriously Ukraine is investing in long-term military deterrence, even as the war with Russia continues to grind on. But while this announcement has generated significant excitement in defense circles, it's important to understand what this deal actually represents, what the Gripen E is and what it can do, and why it is arguably the most sensible fighter choice Ukraine could have made, even if it won't arrive in meaningful numbers for years. A new beast in an old name. Just days before Ukraine signed its letter of intent, Sweden itself took delivery of its very first Gripen E, the newest and most advanced iteration of a fighter lineage that has been in continuous service since 1996. The Gripen E is such a profound departure from its predecessor, the Gripen C, that there were serious internal discussions at Saab about giving it an entirely new designation and name altogether. In the end, the Gripen name was retained, but the analogy that best describes the relationship between the C and the E is the same one that describes the F/A-18 Hornet versus the F/A-18 Super Hornet. They share a family resemblance and a lineage, but the newer aircraft is a fundamentally different, dramatically more capable machine. The Gripen E can be broadly described as a fourth-generation airframe fused with fifth-generation avionics, a combination that allows it to punch well above its weight class in certain combat scenarios. It can contend with storied air combat platforms like the F-15 Eagle under the right conditions, deliver an F-35-like degree of situational awareness to its pilot, and do all of this while operating from a stretch of rural highway with little more than a handful of trained technicians and a modest logistics footprint. Perhaps most remarkable of all, it achieves this sweeping capability set at an operating cost that is reportedly among the lowest of any advanced fighter in service today. Estimates suggest the Gripen E costs somewhere between $6,000 and $8,000 per flight hour to operate, compared to $10,000 to $25,000 per hour for the F-16 Viper and north of $30,000 per hour for stealth platforms like the F-35. These figures, as always in the defense world, should be taken with some skepticism. Operating cost calculations are frequently massaged by marketing departments and government public affairs offices, and no two nations or manufacturers calculate them in exactly the same way. But even with that grain of salt firmly applied, the directional comparison remains instructive. Production and the road to delivery. Sweden itself has a standing order for 60 Gripen E aircraft. Export contracts have been signed with Brazil for 36 jets, Thailand for 4, and Colombia for potentially up to 24. Ukraine's order of 100 to 150 fighters would more than double the total existing production demand on Saab's manufacturing lines, a staggering increase that has already prompted Saab to announce plans to establish a Gripen assembly line inside Ukraine itself. This is a significant and hopeful development for Ukrainian industrial sovereignty and long-term security. It means Ukraine isn't simply purchasing a weapons system, it's investing in domestic defense production capacity, which could pay dividends far beyond this particular aircraft. However, it also underscores the timeline challenge. Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson has publicly stated that it will likely take approximately 3 years before the first newly produced Gripen E arrives in Ukraine for operational service, meaning deliveries would begin no earlier than late 2028 or early 2029. For a nation currently fighting for its survival, that timeline might seem discouraging. But as we'll discuss, the Gripen E order is less about winning the current war and more about ensuring Ukraine never finds itself in this position again. Why the Gripen over the F-16? To understand why the Gripen E is the right choice for Ukraine, it helps to understand why the F-16 was chosen earlier in the conflict and what its limitations are in the Ukrainian context. The F-16 was essentially selected over the Gripen for a single overwhelming reason: availability. Over roughly 5 decades of production, Lockheed Martin and its predecessor General Dynamics have manufactured approximately 4,600 F-16s for more than 24 air forces worldwide. At least 2,600 of those remain in active service today, and as NATO allies continue transitioning to the F-35, a steady stream of surplus F-16s has become available for transfer. The global spare parts ecosystem for the F-16 is enormous, and the pool of nations willing to donate or sell used examples to Ukraine was simply much larger than for any other Western fighter. Contrast that with the Gripen. Over roughly 38 years of production, Saab has delivered around 300 Gripens of various variants to a handful of customers, a fraction of the F-16's footprint. Simply put, there were far fewer Gripens to spare, and far fewer nations positioned to provide them. But available and optimal are two different things. The F-16s Ukraine received are modernized to an AM standard, a configuration that, while significantly more capable than the aircraft Ukraine was previously flying, is based on avionics and systems architecture that is roughly a quarter century old. More importantly, the F-16 was designed for and by a military superpower with vast resources, deep maintenance infrastructure, long prepared runways, and a dense logistics network. Ukraine has none of those things in abundance, especially as Russian strikes continue to target airfields and infrastructure. The Gripen was designed in almost directly opposite circumstances, by a relatively small, budget-conscious Nordic nation facing a credible Russian threat across the Baltic, with the explicit requirement that it be operable from dispersed, austere locations with minimal support stretches of highway, improvised airstrips, temporary forward operating bases. That design philosophy couldn't be more relevant to Ukraine's situation today. How the Gripen C and E stack up. The older Gripen C, which forms the backbone of Sweden's current fighter force, is already a competitive aircraft by most conventional metrics. It matches the F-16 in top speed at around Mach 2, achieves a service ceiling comparable to the F/A-18 Super Hornet at approximately 50,000 feet, and boasts a combat radius of around 500 nautical miles. Its thrust-to-weight ratio is slightly lower than the F-16's, but the Gripen C's distinctive delta wing and canard configuration give it exceptional climb performance, allowing it to rapidly reach high altitudes for interception missions. In close-in dogfighting scenarios, Gripens have historically demonstrated the ability to outturn the F-16 under certain conditions, a testament to the aerodynamic versatility of the canard delta layup. The Gripen E builds on that foundation substantially. The older Volvo RM12 turbofan engine, which could produce around 18,100 pounds of thrust with afterburner, has been replaced by a General Electric F414 turbofan, the same engine family that powers the F/A-18 Super Hornet. In the Gripen E application, it generates approximately 22,000 pounds of thrust, representing a roughly 25% increase in power. The aircraft itself is physically larger, adding about a foot to both length and wingspan and increasing gross takeoff weight by more than 5,500 pounds. The net result is that the Gripen E's performance figures are broadly similar to those of the C. Despite the additional mass, the more powerful engine compensates for the added weight, but the combat radius expands dramatically, from approximately 500 nautical miles to around 810. For a country the geographic size of Ukraine, that extended reach is operationally significant. The E also adds 2 additional hardpoints for a total of 10, which Saab says can be configured to carry up to 8 Meteor beyond visual range air-to-air missiles alongside 2 Iris-T short-range infrared-guided missiles. The Meteor deserves special mention here. Developed by MBDA and integrated on Eurofighter, Rafale, and Gripen platforms, the Meteor is widely regarded as the most capable active radar-guided beyond visual range air-to-air missile currently in service anywhere in the world. What sets it apart from conventional ramjet or rocket-propelled missiles is its throttleable duct rocket ramjet propulsion system. Unlike a conventional solid rocket motor that burns its propellant in a fixed profile, the Meteor's ramjet can modulate its thrust throughout flight, burning conservatively at long range to preserve energy, then throttling up aggressively during the terminal engagement phase.
This gives it a dramatically larger no-escape zone than competing missiles, including all but the most recent variants of the American AIM-120 AMRAAM. For Ukraine, whose pilots have been heavily constrained by the range limitations of their existing air-to-air weapons, this capability would represent a quantum leap. The real revolution. Where the Gripen E truly distinguishes itself from its predecessors and from many of its Western contemporaries is in its avionics suite and electronic warfare systems. The older Gripen C was equipped with a capable but aging pulse Doppler mechanically scanned radar. The Gripen E replaces this with the ES-05 Raven Active Electronically Scanned Array, or AESA radar, developed by Leonardo. AESA radars represent a fundamental generational leap over older radar technology. Rather than mechanically rotating a single antenna, an AESA radar electronically steers its beam across thousands of individual transmit-receive modules, enabling it to track multiple targets simultaneously, switch frequencies rapidly to resist jamming, and perform multiple radar functions concurrently. Crucially for Ukraine, virtually no current Russian fighter with the sole exception of the extremely rare and expensive Su-57 is equipped with an AESA radar. This means Gripen E pilots would enjoy a meaningful radar technology advantage over virtually every Russian aircraft they are likely to encounter. Supplementing the AESA radar is the Leonardo Skyward G Infrared Search and Track System, or IRST. This passive sensor detects and tracks targets based on their thermal signatures: engine heat, aerodynamic friction, exhaust, without emitting any detectable electromagnetic energy of its own. This is critically important in a contested electromagnetic environment, because the moment a fighter activates its radar, it broadcasts its presence to anyone listening. An IRST system allows a Gripen E to detect, track, and potentially engage targets while remaining electronically silent. Multiple Gripen ES operating together can triangulate a target's position using their respective IRST sensors from different angles, compounding accuracy without revealing themselves through radar emissions. The cockpit itself reflects the same philosophy of managed information superiority. Rather than the traditional arrangement of dozens of individual gauges and displays that dominated earlier generations of fighter cockpits, the Gripen E uses wide area displays that present fused, computer-processed data in an intuitive format. The underlying philosophy closely mirrors what the F-35 does with its sensor fusion, taking raw data from multiple onboard and offboard sensors and synthesizing it into a single coherent picture of the battle space. A Gripen E can serve as a flying quarterback for a mixed formation that includes older Gripen C and D aircraft, sharing its superior situational awareness across the network and enabling older jets to engage targets they could not have independently detected or tracked. The electronic warfare suite on the Gripen E was specifically developed with Russian air defenses in mind, a design requirement that makes it almost uniquely well suited to the Ukrainian theater. The system employs three categories of signal generation working in concert. The first is a digital radio frequency memory, or DRFM, system that reads incoming radar signals and retransmits mirrored returns that obscure or falsify the aircraft's actual position. This is the same underlying technology used in the American ADM-160 miniature air-launched decoy, the MALD, which essentially functions as a cruise missile that mimics the radar signature of large aircraft to overwhelm and confuse enemy air defenses. In the Gripen E's application, this capability is turned inward. Rather than creating false large targets, it hides or displaces the actual fighter's signature. The second system is a Doppler signal generator that creates phantom targets, additional false contacts that blink in and out of radar screens, forcing enemy operators to sort through a cloud of spoofed tracks to find the real aircraft. The third is a broadband noise emitter that saturates the electromagnetic spectrum in the aircraft's vicinity, degrading the quality of any radar picture an adversary is trying to build. These three systems working together make it extraordinarily difficult for Russian surface-to-air missile systems to achieve a reliable weapons quality track on a Gripen E. Where the Gripen truly shines. Raw flight performance and avionics are only part of the Gripen story.
Perhaps its most underappreciated quality is its extraordinary ease of ground operations, a characteristic that flows directly from its design philosophy and that has direct, practical relevance to how Ukraine would actually use these aircraft. The Gripen E requires a takeoff roll of approximately 1,640 feet and can land in as little as 600 meters, about 1,970 feet. The F-16 needs nearly 2,650 feet to land safely. More importantly, the Gripen was designed from its inception to operate from any straight, flat 500-meter stretch of road or highway, not just from dedicated military airfields with long-prepared runways, hardened shelters, and fully equipped maintenance facilities. Ukraine has been losing those assets to Russian strikes throughout the war. A dispersed basing concept enabled by the Gripen's austere operations capability would make Ukrainian air power far harder to suppress. The maintenance philosophy is equally impressive. In 2024, U.S. Air Force technicians set a platform record for the F-15E Strike Eagle, completing an integrated combat turn of full refueling and rearming cycle in 32 minutes. The F-15E has 2 engines and carries substantially more fuel than a Gripen. The Gripen's own integrated combat turn time is 10 minutes, and it requires only 1 qualified technician and 5 lightly trained support personnel to accomplish it. Saab claims that those 5 support personnel need only approximately 10 weeks of training to be able to support that kind of operation, a remarkably low training burden. The operational model Saab envisions for a standard Gripen combat force involves 16 aircraft, 14 operational, 2 in reserve, supported by a total of about 100 people including 32 pilots, 32 technicians, and 40 conscript-level support staff. From this configuration, Saab claims the force can generate 112 combat sorties, each involving 8 aircraft, within a single 24-hour period, and that the entire logistics package can be contained within just 2 standard 20-foot shipping containers. Even a small 3-aircraft detachment operating from a dispersed austere location, supported by just 18 people, could generate 4 combat sorties per day and sustain 8 hours of daily combat time with minimal logistics infrastructure. Older Gripens for Ukraine sooner. Given that new-build Gripen ES won't reach Ukraine until 2028 at the earliest, there is a meaningful possibility that Sweden could accelerate the timeline by transferring some of its existing Gripen C and D aircraft to Ukraine as those jets are phased out of Swedish service and replaced by the new E variant. Sweden currently operates approximately 74 Gripen CS alongside 24 two-seat Gripen DS, the latter used for advanced training and complex multi-role missions. Sweden's stated goal is to field a combined Gripen fleet of 120 aircraft by the end of the decade, timed to coincide with the delivery of its 60 new Gripen ES. Assuming the production schedule holds, always an uncertain proposition in major defense programs, that transition could free up somewhere in the range of 38 surplus Gripen C and D aircraft. These older jets are not the revolutionary leap that the E represents, but they are still modern, capable 4th-generation fighters that are vastly superior to the Soviet-era aircraft Ukraine started the war with, and meaningfully superior in certain operational respects to the aging F-16 AMS Ukraine currently flies. More importantly, operating Gripen CS and DS would allow Ukraine to begin building the institutional knowledge, maintenance expertise, pilot proficiency, and support infrastructure needed for the Gripen E well before the newer jets arrive. Brazil, which was the first export customer to receive the Gripen E, put its pilots through a roughly 20-week transition training curriculum when converting from their older F-5M Tiger IIS. The Swedish Defense Ministry has noted that pilots already familiar with the Gripen C or D will find the E recognizable. The primary difference lies in the volume and sophistication of information the pilot must process, not in the fundamental handling characteristics of the aircraft. Ukrainian pilots already trained on the Gripen C and Gripen D could likely transition to the E on a substantially abbreviated timeline. Deterrence, not just defense. It would be easy and understandable to view this deal through the lens of Ukraine's current, desperate fight for survival and feel a measure of frustration that these jets won't arrive in time to change its immediate trajectory. But that framing misses the more important strategic dimension of this acquisition. The F-16 deliveries that began in mid-2024, however significant as a milestone, were never going to be the decisive factor in a war of this scale and intensity. A few dozen modernized fighters, however capable, cannot by themselves turn the tide of a conflict involving hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of artillery pieces, and a vast and overlapping air defense network on both sides. The same is true of the Gripen E order. What the Gripen E represents for Ukraine is something more durable and more valuable than a near-term tactical advantage. It represents the foundation of a future Ukrainian Air Force that was designed and built for the specific adversary Ukraine faces, a force capable of operating under distributed, dispersed, low logistics conditions against the precise electronic warfare and air defense architecture Russia has fielded. It represents domestic production capacity that gives Ukraine some measure of independence from the political volatility of foreign arms transfers. And it represents a credible deterrence signal, a message to Moscow that even if this war ends, Ukraine will not remain defenseless. The opening months of the Russian invasion, when armored columns were closing on Kiev and many analysts predicted the Ukrainian government would fall within days, feel almost like ancient history now. More than 3.5 years later, Russia has absorbed more than 1 million casualties and lost tens of thousands of armored vehicles, aircraft, and air defense assets. Despite all of that, Russia has managed to capture only somewhere between 18 and 20% of Ukrainian territory. Whatever territory Ukraine may ultimately lose in any eventual settlement, the question of whether Ukraine as a nation survives has been answered. It will survive. The Gripen E order is Ukraine's investment in making sure that survival extends indefinitely into the future, and that the next time Moscow contemplates aggression against its neighbor, the calculus looks very different than it did in February 2022. And that is the Gripen E story, not just a fighter jet, but a statement. A statement that Ukraine is done just surviving and is now building towards something permanent. A nation that was supposed to fall in days is now signing billion-dollar defense contracts and planning domestic fighter production. That says everything. If you enjoyed the breakdown, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment below. I read every single one. Hit the bell so you never miss a drop. I'll see you in the next one.